And I'm kind of actually, so I'm not sure. And then, I'm going to talk about 30 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. French Nobel laureate Romaine, a disciple of Freud, called it the oceanic experience. German Lutheran theologian and philosopher Rudolph Otto, in his 1917 seminal work Das Heilige, called it the experience of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the fearsome and attractive mystery, from which people cringe in fear and yet are inexorably drawn to approach, as was Moses to the burning bush. The human quest to experience and therefore to understand, or at least to intuit our place in the universe, and our relationship with the author of the universe, is, it would seem, a fairly common phenomenon among human beings, and finds examinations and explorations in all of the world's religious traditions. One might even venture to say, along with Thomas Aquinas, that to be human is to have the capacity, whether actualized or not, to experience the divine. On his first visit to New York City, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, walked up to a hot dog vendor and said, "Please make me one with everything." So I'd like to present a very brief sketch of what various human traditions have called the religious experience. I'm not going to talk about dogmas or doctrines that these same human traditions have extrapolated from the religious experience of people. What I talk about is it's very human to try to make sense of a unique experience of God or of the universe or of the unnameable, to reflect upon the fact and to try to find words to express the possible meaning of what a profoundly personal and exceedingly difficult experience it is to describe in human language. Each new articulation is typically drafted with words borrowed from the tradition that a person grows up in, and then grafted onto that pre-existing religious tradition, allowing the tradition to live and to grow and to change. At the same time, there are instances in which the religious experience caused the subject to alter the course of their religious tradition or to found an entirely new religious tradition. We will come to see over the next few minutes that mysticism starts in the mist and ends in schism. I'm only going to reference the language of religious traditions to the extent that they afford human beings an intelligible context, at once liberating and confining. Human language liberates us, but it confines us at the same time, within which religious feelings and with religious impulses occur, and through which they are owned and remembered and then related to others. A few definitions to start. The English word experience comes from the Latin experientia, whose earliest connotations involved a testing by proof or trial. So a scientific experiment is, for example, carefully curated sequence of experiences. To a pre-modernist mindset, any human experience was a direct knowledge of a thing. Modernists introduced the notion of subjectivity and bias, and then postmodernists posited that subjectivity is actually overwhelming. So three professional baseball umpires walk into a bar and they have beers and they're talking about how they call balls and strikes. And the pre-modernist baseball umpire says, "I call them the way they are." The modernist says, "I call them the way I see them." And the postmodernist says, "They don't exist until I call them." In current usage, experience is the subjective observation of actions or events that are themselves the source of knowledge, or a consciousness of just being alive. By experience, we mean the actual living through or direct impressions of the sum total of conscious events that compose an individual human life. All of us, right now in this moment, are currently experiencing a common set of perceptions: the feel of the air temperature, the sight of Manny's event space, the sound of my voice,
Subjectively, however, we are each experiencing this moment differently, some with mild curiosity, others with growing boredom. And since our subject today is religious experience, we need a definition of the word religion. The Latin religionem connoted respect for what is sacred, reverence for the gods, and also an obligation to the bond between humans and the gods. Religionem is derived from the Latin religio, the ultimate origins of which are more in dispute. Cicero posited that the origin of the word religio came from relegere, to read again. So for example, you get to the end of the day and you say like, what happened to me today? How did I feel? What were my experiences? When was I happy? When was I sad? When was I upset? What caused those things? So religion can be that practice of reflection and of trying to find the red thread that connects all of these different experiences of a human life. Teleology, a notion that we're actually headed towards some goal. All of the other ancients, oh, and by the way, if you want to start a big fight in a room of evolutionary biologists, just ask the naive question, evolution, is it tending towards an end? And by the way, is the end inside or outside the system? And you get a big fight. Now, all the other ancients disagreed with Cicero, and instead they saw the root of the word religion in re ligare, to bind together. So we have ligaments, right, that hold our muscles to our bones. By human choices and actions and by natural catastrophes, human lives and human communities are regularly torn apart. We call it injustice, we call it outrage. But regularly communities are broken, families are broken, lives are broken. The role of religion is to heal, to bind back together that which is broken, to reconcile what is estranged, including the ruptures in the relationships between humans and the divine. So John Courtney Murray, a Jesuit, wrote a great book called We Hold These Truths in 1961. And in the middle of it, he makes this interesting comment. He said, in a human community, the two most important professions are the lawyer and the priest, or the minister, the shaman. Because the lawyer, her job is to right relationships, to repair relationships and restore justice. And then the priest, the shaman, the rabbi is to restore relationships between the humans and the divine. Holding these two different etymologies, to reread and to restore, can be helpful as we think about what we're talking about tonight. If there is such a thing as a religious experience, that is, if it's possible for human beings to experience the presence and the action of the divine, then such an experience would take place within nature and would occur by means of our human sense experiences. A human experience of the divine is, by definition, a human experience, and one that follows the pattern of every other type of human experience. And finally, a pair of words that we will want to use, sacred and profane. One may have the general sense that most all human beings are basically good and deserving of our respect, but human communities throughout history and in all cultures often single out certain persons and invest them with a special status as intermediaries between the community and the gods, the priest, the rabbi, the shaman. These people are ordained by the community with sacred power. These people have often a distinctive type of clothing, special status, taboos, and limitations that ordinary folks don't have. And they are thought to be one of the means by which ordinary people communicate with the divine in particularly efficacious ways. One might think that the world is beautiful and good, but again, human communities, we bless and consecrate a particular tree, a forest grove, a river, a mountain, and call that place sacred, more special than all of the other beautiful places. Such a place becomes imbued with what the Germans call Doppelbodigkeit, a floor under the floor. So I'm on a stage and there's a floor underneath the stage, 6-8 inches below. And in a professional theater, you have trapdoors, right? And so you can kind of go from the stage, you can disappear and reappear. And the German notion of Doppelbödigkeit is that there's the okay world, the normal world that we live in all the time. And every once in a while, you're just walking down the street or you're sitting under a tree and you suddenly drop to a deeper level of reality. You suddenly have this profound sense and experience that the world is profoundly beautiful, special, and that you belong in the universe. That's the experience of the sacred. The word sacred comes from the Latin sacer, meaning dedicated or consecrated. Human beings, as I say, regularly select spaces, times, seasons, or objects and imbue them with a special quality of heightened access to the divine. Pagodas, synagogues, temples, or churches are buildings like other buildings, right? They're like department stores and gas stations. But they're constructed by human hands. But then once they're blessed by the community, they become an axis mundi. They become a focal point between heaven and earth. So you walk into one of these sacred buildings, whether it's a Shinto shrine or a mosque, and the community has empowered this place with special meaning. The Jewish survivor of a shipwreck found years later on this desert island had built 2 synagogues, not just one, but 2. And when asked why, he said, well, this is the one I worship in, and this is the one in which I would never set foot. The sacred, therefore, can awaken tribal feelings in us. And the sacred can be ways in which we separate ourselves as one group of people over and against another group of people. So the sacred can be, how would I say it, manipulated by human beings for ends against which it really is not intended. In these sacred spaces, sacred texts are read, sacred rites are performed, and these cultural constructs give participants permission, if you will, to access the spiritual realm, to ask God or the gods or the universe for graces and blessings on newborn children, on newly married couples, on the sick and the dying, and on the souls of the dead whom we send to the other side. One would think that the profane is simply the opposite of the sacred, but it's a bit more complicated, actually. The word for temple in Latin is fanum. We have a rarely used English word, fane, meaning a church building. So you construct a temple, and the profanum, in front of the temple, that's the profane. It's just the front yard of the church. And so, it's not really the opposite of the sacred. It's just that it's just outside of that which we have designated as special. To cast off dull care and enter into sacred space and sacred time, human cultures engage and create rituals. There is much debate among scholars as to the definition of the word ritual. Shaking hands is a ritual. Kissing people on the cheek is a ritual. Saying good morning, how do you do, is a ritual. Let me just say that, so ritual is a conscious and voluntary, repetitious and stylized symbolic action by persons or groups who seek contact with the transcendent dimension of reality. So ritual is also a way in which a community passes on from one generation to the next the collective wisdom and collective memory of the group. In this way, ritual is both a context within which a person might have an experience of the sacred, and at the same time, it's a school of the affections that prepare the adherent for a possible future experience. It is common to distinguish between ritualism and mysticism. Ritualism for most religious people can be as much of an unthinking habit as it is a devotion. So some people no longer believe in God, but they can't break the habit of going to church on Sunday. Some people have such a profound experience of God that it leads them out of their conservative, staid religious community and live a deeper spirituality or even a mysticism, either as hermits or founders of new religious movements. We also find ritual to be especially important in mystical groups. So if you've ever been to a Zen monastery or known people who are in a Sufi order or Jewish mystical communities or Hindu yogic ashrams or even Benedictine monasteries, these are collections of people who've sort of become expert practitioners, advanced practitioners. And ritual fills up most moments of their daily life. The monastic tradition in the West, born in the 3rd century in the desert of Egypt, and given lasting form by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, held that ora et labora, prayer and work, prayer and labor are equally important pathways to communion with one another in the community and with God. Ritual holistically engages the embodied human person. So ritual involves our physical posture, bodily movements, singing, chanting, eating and drinking, seeing, hearing, smelling. Ritual is very, very embodied. This is important because, the body is the venue of religious experience. We'll leave aside for today out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. They're really cool, but they're pretty rare. And what's important, I think, is what's much more common and what's generally available. Rituals typically center around the reenactment of cosmically important events that constitute the founding memory and the ongoing identity of a community. Christian rites of baptism not only name and give membership to this newly born person, but baptism also recalls the creation of the world, the crossing of the Red Sea and the Exodus event, Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River, his crucifixion, at which blood and water flowed from his side. Rituals, thus, are religious in the 2 senses of the word. They're religious in the sense of re legere, a rereading of the current events against the backdrop of salvation history, just as they allow for a personal rereading of one's own life trajectory within a larger commonly shared narrative of meaning and sense. Cyclical reading of sacred texts throughout a liturgical year is often coordinated with the seasons and with the human life cycle for this very purpose. It's kind of a bummer with Christianity that, like Christmas, we chose the winter solstice, and then Easter, we chose like the beginning of springtime. But if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, those don't work. So religious rituals serve the function of re ligare, restoring cosmic order and reconciling and healing that which is broken. Rites of exorcism are found in all religious traditions, as are rites of reconciliation and forgiveness. Also common in the great religions is the practice of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is basically a very long, drawn-out ritual, but one that happens mostly outside the control of religious authority figures. An aspect of popular religion, and thus very protean, pilgrimage traditions often start up in a rebellion against institutionalized religion and its authority figures. Over time, organized religions adopt, adapt, and tame pilgrimages, tweaking their meaning even as they validate their authenticity. So, what is a pilgrimage? A believer in any culture may sometimes look beyond the local shrine, beyond the local temple or the church, and feel the call of some distant holy place, renowned for miracles and the revivification of faith. And then this person resolves to go on a quest. Benares in India for the Hindus, Jerusalem for Jews and Christians and Muslims, Mecca for Muslims, Ise for Shintos, Saikoku for Buddhists, both of those in Japan. For Catholics, Fatima in Portugal, Lourdes in France, Tepeyac in Mexico. Whatever the site, whatever the culture, the general features of a pilgrim's journey in all these different traditions are remarkably similar. Here's just a kind of a generalized account. Once upon a time, in a place apart, there appeared a holy person. Miracles occurred at that place and drew multitudes of pilgrims. Later, a shrine was built there by devotees. Now, in the present time, those who are afflicted by some disease or some weight make a promise to the holy person in their hearts, if you help me, I will make the journey to your shrine and perform devotions there for you. The journey will be arduous and inconvenient, but the goal beckons. The source out there is one that will heal both the body and the soul, and worldly considerations all fall away. The pilgrim sets out lightheartedly. She travels, she joins with many others who are bound in the same direction, and bonds of friendship and even a community forms along the way of the journey. The pilgrim calls at the way stations along the way, either with each of which strengthens her faith. And then as she nears her goal, she can see the shrine already from a distance, and she weeps with joy. Then she enters the sacred domain. She is conscious of actually seeing with her own eyes the place of these renowned holy events. And while her feet touch the very ground that the Holy One trod, at last she is in the presence of the sacred, and she is in awe. She touches the shrine with her hand and remains there a long time in bliss and in prayer. She has her moment. And then afterwards, she gives her offerings. She makes the rounds to lesser shrines that cluster around the main one. Before she leaves, she eats holy food and calls at the market for pious presents to take home as gifts. Her return journey is cheerful, for her affliction is lifted. And then when she arrives home, her family and neighbors feel and share in the blessings that have come to her. Now, in this account, we hear the typical features of pilgrimage: a desire to leave the familiar and the mundane, to set out on a religious quest, to gain some favor for yourself or for a loved one, to atone for a sin or a crime, to rekindle a relationship with God, whatever the person desires, they take with them on this pilgrimage. The journey itself is cleansing, the route is sacred and traditional, and the destination is holy. During the journey, the pilgrim will often wear special garb. So if you're on your way to Compostela, you wear like a seashell around your neck. And that way the pilgrims can recognize each other. It's some visible symbol. The destination is reached, the sacred is experienced, grace is received, and the life world of the pilgrim is changed. Pilgrim returns home, but neither he nor home are ever quite the same. And for Muslims, for example, you change your name. You become Haji, because you've made the Hajj. The most visited pilgrimage shrine in the world is the Basilica of Our Lady Guadalupe in Mexico City, which houses this miraculous image of the Virgin Mary imprinted on a peasant's cloak almost 5 centuries ago. The origin story is revelatory of how pilgrimages start. The peasant in question is a person whose Spanish name is Juan Diego, although he was born Aztec before the conquest of Hernan Cortez. So Juan Diego is not his real name. On the morning of December 9th, 1531, Juan Diego saw a vision of a maiden at a place called the Hill of Tepeyac. Speaking to Juan Diego in his native Nahuatl language, the language of the Aztec Empire, the maiden identifies herself as the Virgin Mary, mother of the very true deity, and asked for a church to be built on that particular site in her honor. Based on her words, Juan Diego then sought out the Archbishop, the Catholic Archbishop of Mexico City, Fray Juan de Zumárraga, to tell him about what happened. The bishop doesn't believe him. He's an Aztec fellow. So Juan Diego goes back and he sees the Virgin Mary a second time. He has a second vision. She asks him to go back to the Archbishop and keep insisting. Eventually, the Virgin gave Diego a sign that he would take to the Archbishop to prove that he was neither lying nor insane. So here it is, December, near Mexico City, very high altitude, it's freezing cold, it's winter, and miraculously all these roses, spring up. And so he pulls all these roses up and he puts them in his cloak and he carries the roses back to the cathedral and he opens his cloak in front of the Archbishop and says, "Here's the sign from the Virgin." Well, yeah, the roses fall out, but also then on the tilde is this image of the Virgin Mary imprinted on the cloak. And if you go to Mexico City, 500 years later, the image is still there. Now, the basilica, it should be noted, was built on the site of an Aztec temple to the mother goddess Tonantzin, which the Spanish had destroyed 10 years prior in their forced conversion of the people to Catholicism. My point in relating the story is to point out the tension between religious experience and organized religion. Indeed, popular religiosity is often anti-institutional, just as Jesus of Nazareth's greatest foes were the priests and the religious authorities in his day. Juan Diego had seen the wholesale destruction of his previous life world. The Aztecs had gone from being the masters of an empire to slave holders themselves to being slaves within the Spanish Empire. His reported religious experience is of the Virgin Mary, who asks him to have a church built in her honor, but also calls him her child and promises him and his people in his native language her protection. In many ways, Diego's religious experience gave him a spiritual weapon to wield against the Spanish. Over the centuries, it became common practice for Mexican laborers to have the image of the Virgin Mary tattooed on their backs so that their overseers would not beat them. The apparition also afforded Juan Diego and his people with a path of syncretism, whereby they could keep aspects of their religious tradition by grafting them onto Catholicism, and so forge a new identity of the Mexican people, who are neither Spaniards, nor Aztecs, nor Toltecs, nor Mayans, but something new, a mestizaje, a mixture that is more than the sum of the parts. In the years after the apparition, Franciscan missionaries fought hard against the cult, casting doubts on the veracity of Juan Diego's account, while the Dominicans, another Catholic order, favored and championed it. And it wasn't until the year 2002 that the institutional Catholic Church declared Juan Diego a saint. But Mexicans had believed this to be true for 5 centuries. And their pilgrimages to the Basilica produced not only a string of miracles, but also a shared national identity based on a religious revelation of divine maternal care. Not seldom was she referred to as Our Lady of Tonantzin, the name of the Aztec mother goddess. So far, we've talked about the shared context within which human experience of the divine can happen, religious rituals of various sorts. There is, of course, the other and far more common context within religious experiences occur, personal prayer. Certainly, rituals marry together 2 very potent avenues: formulaic prayers that express the inherited spiritual wisdom of the community and its religious tradition on the one hand, and a rich symbol structure which expresses the same tradition in a wholly other semiotic structure, word and sacrament, text and act, idea and experience, all under the broad umbrella of a living religious tradition and its authority figures. Certainly, people have profoundly powerful and life-changing religious experiences within the context of ritual or liturgy. But private prayer, in all of its manifold forms, is the far more frequent reported venue for human experiences of the divine. Which begs the hardest question of all: what is prayer? Thought of as a human communication with the divine and with spiritual entities, prayer has been present in most all of the religious traditions in human history. Indeed, most of those traditions see prayer as a necessity for the human condition. Prayer can be, as we have previously discussed, a reflective rereading of the totality of one's experience over the course of the last day, the last week, the last month, the last year. Or it can be sort of a confessional opening up to God, by which we ask God directly and within the time of our prayer to help us, to see the sense, to sense the direction, to chart the course that is our personal life journey. Prayer can also be, as was mentioned, a beseeching of God to intervene, to step in and fill the breach, to calm the storm, to end the plague, to restore the world to the natural harmony to which it was destined at its beginning. Personal prayer can take many forms as it responds to the typical needs of human beings, petitions or supplications to God for things that we want. Let me win the lottery. Petitions or supplications, the cure of a sick relative, a bountiful crop, a good score on a test, or the sudden death of an adversary. Pray for that. Thanksgiving prayers for graces received, dedication prayers whereby we pledge ourselves to a course of action or a state of life, intercessions whereby we ask God to bend the course of events to a good end, confessions whereby we own up to sins and crimes we've committed and ask for pardon and peace and reconciliation, penitence whereby we ask God to restore us to divine friendship and favor, and benediction, where we simply and wholeheartedly praise God for his goodness with no strings attached. This latter may be the purest form of prayer, but that's a value judgment on my part. All of this implies a very active sort of mental prayer, where we are talking to the divine and suggesting most humbly how the universe should be ordered. A friend of mine, Carmichael Peters, says when he dies, the first thing he's going to do is organize a protest in heaven. You could have done a much better job. Come on. One of the great modern scholars to reflect on prayer was Rabbi and Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel. In his 1954 book, Man's Quest for God, he wrote, quote, "The issue of prayer is not prayer. The issue of prayer is God." And in an essay entitled On Prayer, he wrote, quote, "We pray in order to pray. I pray because I am unable to pray. We utter the words of the Kaddish, magnified and sanctified by his great name in the world which he has created according to his will. Our hope is to enact, make real the sanctification of this name here and now," end quote. And finally, in The Insecurity of Freedom, 1966, Heschel wrote, "Different are the languages of prayer, but the tears are the same. We have a vision in common of him in whose compassion all of our prayers meet." Finally, there comes a time in prayer where human words must cease, where human thoughts have to rest, where human activity must pause so that human beings might be attentive should the divine deign to speak. Zen Buddhism trains the neophyte to quiet the mind and to be attentive. Benedictine monks learn to sit fully attentive, thinking no thoughts, waiting, listening. The deepest level of prayer, I would suggest, is the human attentiveness to the divine. Thinking nothing, wanting nothing, asking nothing, simply listening, paying attention, chasing away the distractions and recentering again and again, hoping wordlessly to experience the presence of the divine, who may speak a word or who may simply convey an impression of presence. When this happens, how do people describe it? So the American philosopher and psychologist William James published in 1902 The Varieties of Religious Experience. He combed through the classics and read the accounts of mystics, of religious practitioners who describe, quote, "the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual persons in their solitude, insofar as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider to be the divine." Now, James chose to look at religious experiences reported to have occurred in solitude so as to draw out the inwardness and the personal dimension of such encounters with the holy other. Central to his findings is the notion of relationality. Human beings don't first report that they came to know themselves better. Rather, they report that they experienced something other than themselves, some force or presence or reality that affirmed them, transformed them, met them, embraced them. The meeting with the divine could either be unitive or confrontational. That is, the mystical experience would lead some to report that they so entered into intimate union with God that they could no longer tell where they ended and where the divine began. So fused were they in the experience. Recall the Dalai Lama asking for the hot dog vendor, make me one with everything. Others would describe a radical confrontational encounter that humbled them before so great and awesome a reality. The fruit of the encounter can take many forms. It can be cognitive. People report that they gained an insight. It can be inspirational. They received a mission, a commission. Transformative. They took on a vocation. Or sustaining. They found the strength to just keep on keeping on with the commitments and the generosity they'd already engaged in. One universal feature that James found consistently was that of transcendence. A human experience of the divine is a vivid experience of the sacred, and it gives rise in us to a sense of reverence and awe and wonder. Interestingly, in many ways, very heartening, is another observation that James made. Whether it was an uneducated farmer, a distracted business person, or a slothful nun, there are many cases recorded where God seems to have taken the initiative. The subject was not praying. The subject was not seeking. The subject was going about the business of dull care when suddenly, without cause and unbidden, the divine was present powerfully, awesomely, as to St. Paul, who was knocked off his horse and onto his ass on the road to Damascus. I began by quoting two thinkers, Romaine, Rolanda, and Rudolph Otto. Let me return to them now. Romaine Rolanda called it the oceanic feeling. So imagine yourself out at Ocean Beach or down at Carmel with a heavy surf and a dramatic sky. To stand before the sea is the sense that what lies before us is profound. Its depths unimaginable, its power indomitable. Rolanda used this metaphor for that experience of the divine that impresses without destroying, that affirms without enthralling. The oceanic feeling conveys the sense that despite our frailty, we belong in the universe. God wills us to exist. In a December 5th, 1927 letter to Sigmund Freud, Rolanda wrote, quote, I would have liked to see you do an analysis of the spontaneous religious sentiment, or more exactly, of the religious feeling, which is the simple and direct fact of the feeling of the eternal. For Rolanda, this experience of being at one with the universe without reference to any creed or ritual was in fact the foundational human experience of the divine, a primal experience that then found expression in creeds and rituals and religion. Rudolph Otto carried this thought further in his own investigations. He characterized the human experience of the divine, as I said, as an encounter with the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the tremendous, as in fearsome and awesome, and attractive mystery. To meet the eternal, the sacred, the holy was at once to feel fear and attraction. Fear because I am so small, so contingent, so ephemeral in the face of such awesome majesty. And yet, even as I recoil in shame and fear, the awesome mystery beckons me, attracts me, calls me, seduces me. As the prophet Jeremiah said, when reflecting on his vocational encounter with God, quote, you have seduced me, Lord, and I have let myself be seduced. You have overpowered me. You were the stronger, end quote. So let me end this talk with a word about the importance of memory. Some people have only one or just a few amazingly vivid and absolutely profound religious experiences in a lifetime. Some people report a succession of such experiences spread over years, even decades. And some people report and reflect upon the silence of God, who for a time was readily present and powerful, and then inexplicably very quiet and seemingly absent. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, late in life, admitted that she had lived for decades without any consolation in prayer. For her and for many people I have spoken to in my 30 years as a priest and 40 years as a Jesuit, memories of past experiences of consolation, experiences of grace are vital. Even just one experience of the divine can and sometimes must last a lifetime. Thank you. Well, happy to, questions or comments or.
I might start us off. I guess my question for you is, in a time like we are living in, where I feel like many are starting to question, I don't know if I would say faith, but just question holiness and like what's happening in our universe. What advice would you have to like younger folks, right, who maybe aren't super religious, but are also trying to make sense of the world that we live in today and make sense that there is still something higher and there is still something better to believe in?
Thank you. Great question. So I think, one of my main points is that religious experience is universally available, and it founds a person's sense that they belong in the universe and that they have inestimable worth and dignity. That can get caught up in human religious constructs and human religious organizations and institutions, and it can get fairly easily turned into forms of defining reality, which takes the mystery out of it. So I say that for younger people, but for all human beings, you have to trust your heart first. Your heart never lies to you. Your mind, we can make up all kinds of reasons. Rationality can construct all kinds of, but these foundational experiences that we belong and that we are held by God allow us to live lives of meaning, where it's going to always be we're brokering, right? We're brokering between the values of our community, the values of our traditions, but those traditions, they have to be alive, and they have to continue to grow and change, and they have to be able to be self-correcting. And I think religious traditions are self-correcting because of the religious experience of each generation. They kind of see, gee, we've woven a lot of bias and we've woven a lot of inequality into our articulation of our common faith.
Sort of building on Angelina's question, talking about the profane approaches to the experience of the divine. Like a lot of my friends of my generation who maybe have a mystical bent are turning to psychedelics as a way of like seeking out that Doppelbodigkeit and like that sense of belonging and transcendent experience. And report, like, I think would agree with many of your depictions. What do you think that approach misses or lacks, or how might that be perhaps put to best use in the way that you are thinking of this?
So like the walkabout in Australia among the native peoples, the peyote culture of the native peoples in the Southwest, there is a kind of a subset of religiosity where even like fasting, right? So you fast and fast and fast, and then you're like really hungry. And then you have a kind of this powerful religious experience. So I think in all religious traditions, there are these variations of people subjecting their bodies to certain stimulation or to certain, to kind of get them out of that everyday normal world to this deeper world. I don't think it's necessary. And in some ways, I think that it can be a great way for someone to begin their path. But I think we need to be able to just, become quiet and reflective, and then not even reflect, attentive, just attentive. And you can hear the universe say your name with love. And that's an experience you can really kind of own. And that's why I say memory is so important, because you have to own those experiences. They're real, they're true, they're foundational. And sometimes we forget them too easily, or we push them aside, or we say like, wow, it doesn't fit with my everyday mindset. but actually it's the foundation of a better everyday mindset.
Thank you first for your talk. You had mentioned that both prayer and ritual were two of the components for experiencing the sacred. And I was wondering if in your experience and, talking to other people and in your life, but also what the many of the people that you quoted have to talk about the basis of, ethical conduct and living a life of integrity in order to create the causes and conditions along with prayer and ritual. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, those issues in terms of being open to religious experience. Thank you.
It's a terrific, terrific question. I make a distinction between morality and ethics. So morality would be an established set of rules in a given society. And that could, a given morality could justify slavery, could justify all kinds of, structured injustices. But a morality is sort of a code of conduct shared in a community. Socrates says that ethics is not a set of rules. Ethics is how we live our lives. So I think that ethics comes from that deeper place of integrity, where a human person has experienced some form of liberation and then can think bigger than the inherited categories that they've received, and that's how traditions grow forward, and that's how we become more just over time. That's how we, become. That's how liberation happens. That's how the exodus happens. So, and integrity. I love this definition of integrity. It's what I feel deeply in my heart, and what I understand really well with my mind, and what I say with my words, and what I do with my hands. It's all the same thing. And I think that kind of integrity comes from a deep sense of being held by the universe and being, liberated from the mindset you inherited to a better one. There's no leap from limited to perfect, but each generation we can just imagine ourselves a bit better, imagine our community a bit more integrated, a bit more holistic, a bit more respectful. Yeah. And I would think that, sort of that foundational experience is the way in which people find the strength, the courage, and the integrity to be ethical. Sir?
Why do you think that for some people, the image of Pope Francis is an angel, and then for others, he's a devil? What is it about Francis that goes to those two extremes?
Well, I love Francis. And he's not a perfect person at all, but he's a Jesuit. And so what's at the heart of being a Jesuit? Ignatius Valera founded us, and his one insight, Ignatius's one big insight, he was wounded in battle, had a 6-month convalescence. He spent his afternoons, there was no book in the castle. He spent his afternoons daydreaming. And sometimes he would daydream about, I'm going to get better, and I'm going to improve my sword fighting, and I'm going to go to court, and I'm going to marry a princess, and I'm going to have a rich and happy life. And then other afternoons, he's like, maybe I should be like Francis of Assisi, or maybe I should just go out and help people. And then this was his one insight. He noticed that when he daydreamed about ambition and vainglory and stuff like that, he ended up feeling kind of empty and disconnected and frustrated, versus those afternoons when he daydreamed about just being helpful to people. He had an abiding sense of consolation. He had an abiding sense of happiness. And that's it. That's the whole thing that the Jesuits bring to the world. That the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola is about helping people to get to that place where they can really trust, they take the temperature of your inner weather. And so that's the tradition that Francis grew up in. So, he's pretty free. And So today, he named 3 women to the dicastery of bishops. So there are 3 women, 1 nun and 2 lay women, or two women, two nuns and a lay woman, and they're going to be in charge of like appointing bishops, and he's free. He's free. He's able to kind of imagine, how can we? The Catholic Church is 2,000 years old, and we got a lot of baggage. We got a lot of baggage, and how do we continue to progress and become more kind, more inclusive, a better agent of social justice? And for him, it's by just opening yourself up to the Spirit. And it's an inclusive spirit, and it's a spirit of humility. And yeah, he gets kind of beat up by certain groups that don't want anything to change. What is it that, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Just because you're dead doesn't mean you still can't be part of the conversation. So tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism, which doesn't want anything to change, is the dead faith of the living.
We have one final question. Okay, 2 final questions.
Earlier, when you were talking about experience of the divine, you warned against trying to rationalize it. But I've been very fascinated by like scientific studies around, when Buddhist monks meditate and the brain stuff, and also, analyzing these near-death experiences. And you were quoting Socrates earlier too. So where do you think logic and science and rationality fall into this experience with the divine for those folks that kind of like to embrace science, as some of us do?
Science kind of grew out of religion. So religion was trying to, find explanations of the seasons and explanations of why plants grow, so like that. And that human sort of sense that the divine is inside of everything and causing everything to happen led to the development of that curiosity, which then began to say, well, there are rules of nature, and that God wove these rules into, and that's the birth of science, and science is all about, how do we understand these cyclical, regular, recurring forces? Tom Plant is a professor down at Santa Clara. He'd been at Stanford and chose to move to a Jesuit university. And he's a clinical psychologist. And he's done a number of studies himself, but also studies of studies. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. So, group of cancer patients in a hospital, people with very similar situations. And you divide them up into 2 groups, and you say, okay, this one group, they're going to pray. They're people of faith, and they're going to practice a regular prayer routine with support from chaplains. And all things being equal, they have a statistically significant increased likelihood of recovery. Everybody's receiving the same medical care. Okay, second, there's a group of cancer patients, you find them in 2 groups, and you tell one group, you're being prayed for by a whole bunch of really good-hearted people. And you tell the other group, you're not being prayed for. The first group has a statistically significantly better recovery rate. Now you repeat the experiment, but you don't tell them, and it still works. Now, okay, we've not yet figured out, we haven't come up with a machine that's going to measure prayer, but we know that we have ways of being in touch with each other that go beyond the 5 senses, and science is catching up with it. But I always say we're deeply connected, and religion is not anti-science. Science is the correction of bad religion, and religion is the correction of bad science. Science without religion just gives you bigger and better bombs. And religion without science gives you fanaticism. So I think they need each other.
And then our final question.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. I was really struck at the beginning when you mentioned and I forget who you were quoting, but the role of the attorney and the priest. I was not raised religious in any way, But religious institutions to me have represented a lot of distress in the world for many thousands of years. And so I've really appreciated your framing and helping me reframe some of my thoughts. But my question on that is, what do you see the role of the institution being today, given everything we know?
Yeah. So religious kind of communities around the world have founded orphanages and hospitals, and but they've also launched crusades and supported slavery and so on. So religion is a human phenomenon, and just like military structures and government and business, it's subject to the vicissitudes of either good or bad. I would say that, maybe I can just say it really simply, the hour that we're at service, whether it's Shabbat, or the call to prayer or Mass, the hour that we're kind of as a community practicing a religion together is rehearsal. But really, religion does its work in the other 6.5 days of the week, when we're just being kind to each other. We're just being attentive to opportunities. We're just trying to be more just and humane and sustainable. So, again, religious institutions can either be, forces for good or not. But isn't it interesting that, when the priest commits the heinous crime, it's far more scandalous than when the plumber commits the very same heinous crime. And I'm not saying I should get a free pass, but it's just like we expect more from that person that we have singled out and said, you're supposed to be the spiritual guide here, and you're turning out to be a creep. So it's interesting that but we still have that reaction, right? And a financial scandal in a church is much more scandalous than a financial scandal at a bank, because you're like, they're supposed to be the good people, or they're supposed to be people at their best. I mean, I'll say this, as a Catholic priest, I don't meet better people, but I have the privilege of meeting the best part of people. Because they say, my mother's dying, come over to my house, and let me help me to deal with this.
That's a very powerful note to end on. Yeah,